Hello and welcome back to Principles of Macroeconomics. I am your host, Dr. B, and today we're going to be talking about production and growth, which follows the same type of conversation we just had about gross domestic product and the consumer price index. So, in looking at growth, oftentimes we need to look at the gross domestic product to understand how quickly the country is growing. And of course, that growth using gross domestic product is based off of the levels of production by the companies in the country and whether they're importing, exporting, individual consumption, government spending, savings by individuals. All of these things help us to measure gross domestic product on a per person basis. The higher the gross domestic product for the overall country can be broken out by individuals by simply taking gross domestic product and dividing by the number of individuals living in the country. And that gives us the real GDP per person. This helps us to understand the standard of living for the country. It also helps us to understand the comparison of our country to others. It's also important to understand the growth rate, which tells us how quickly the country is growing on a per person basis. And it tells us how quickly the country grew in a typical year. And understanding the differences in growth rates is important because it helps us to rank countries by their income overall and population to understand changes in sustainability over time. So here we have a list of countries based off of their GDP per person index from about 1870 to 2017. So it's a very long time that we've been recording gross domestic product. And of course, the biggest differences you'll see here is that the more developed the country is, the more mature that it is, the higher the gross domestic product typically is. In developing nations, the GDP may not be as high, but we see that when we compare it over that time period, the developing nations have a relatively higher growth rate than the mature nations. And of course, one of the determinants of understanding gross domestic product is productivity, which tells us the number of goods and services being produced within the nation by the companies using the labor as an input and, of course, the output as the products being developed. So, why is it important? It helps us to understand the standard of living. It helps us to understand the growth rates, and it also helps us to understand the country's income based off of their outputs. So, what are some of the determinants of productivity? Of course, the individual's work capabilities. The citizens go to work for the companies within the country, and their actual physical capacity is a determinant of productivity. The more you work, the more you're producing. Of course, that involves the human capital of things as well, right? Along with machinery and, of course, natural resources and technological advancements. All of these things in conjunction help us to understand productivity of a nation. So the physical capital, we're looking at things like fixed assets, property, plant, and equipment, machinery, etc. The human capital, of course, are the individuals that work within the company that have skills and abilities that they've developed through things like education, training, and experience. The natural resources being used in productivity include things like land, rivers, mineral deposits, etc. It's the physical nature, the physical land. And of course, the technological advancements include things like how well we are developing goods and services aided by technology. So, a more current way of looking at this is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the manufacturing process. Of course, there are some arguments when it comes to growth and the use of natural resources. Natural resources are finite, mostly finite, meaning there is a limit to the amount of natural resources available, especially when it comes to mining for mineral deposits and things like that. Once we've used the mineral deposits, they're gone. It's not something that is renewable. And so the world as a whole, that's probably closer to 10 billion people on the planet today, we are continuously looking at ways to focus on using renewable resources rather than taking from the earth and depleting what's currently there. And a way that we can do that is through the technological advancements that we're making in order to develop new materials, focus on things like recycling, and of course, looking at ways we can improve the natural resources over time. The price of natural resource is that once we've depleted it, it's no longer there, especially when it comes to natural minerals. Uh, and of course, the long term effects on nature uh, have a negative consequence for human society in the future. Uh, Things like less drinking water availability, less food availability, and of course, a lack of resources, which we are currently using for fuel. So, and understanding growth, we also look at sustainability and understanding productivity. We look at things like savings and investment. It is very important that we save and invest our capital, our income. Save and invest. Why is it important to save and invest, you might ask? By saving some resources, it helps us for future growth. We're able to use those resources for various improvements to either the company or to ourselves. And the same with investment. We invest because we want to grow our revenue stream in the future. And so that's why we save and invest. One thing that we're noticing now with higher interest rates is the savings rates are oftentimes also higher. We are spending less on things like goods and services, and we're saving that money in our bank accounts. And by doing that, we're also experiencing a higher rate of return because of the current interest rate situation. Of course, however, the more that we save, there are some diminishing returns that happen, meaning just like the bell curve, we find a plateau and then eventually start to decline. That is what we call the law of diminishing returns. It's for that extra unit of input does not always necessarily mean there's going to be that additional unit of output. So eventually it plateaus. And we see that by looking at what we call the production function. The production function, and I believe this is something we've talked about in the past, is we're looking at where there was lower levels of capital being invested that didn't always necessarily relate to a higher level of output. So this leads to what we call the catch-up effect, where countries that started off poor are rapidly growing, trying to catch up to other nations. Some nations that are not as well off have lower productivity rates and oftentimes less capital to invest in order to improve the job situations in those countries. Wealthier countries, such as the United States, typically have higher productivity rates and additional capital investment opportunities. And of course, the opposite is true with countries that are not as well off. As the borders have shrunk, have the ability to exchange goods, services, and of course, capital across nations in a very quick way. We do this through what we call foreign direct investment, and that is where other nations might invest in other nations in order to grow those individual countries. And oftentimes we also see that uh, when a nation makes an investment into another country, there's of course benefits for both parties involved. And some of those investments include additional capital flowing back to the uh, country of origin where the investment came from. We also see an increase of stock. We also see an increase in capacity, wages, and technology based off of foreign investment. The World Bank is an organization that has been established a long time ago to encourage these types of foreign direct investments from nation to nation. They help to facilitate those types of investments that ultimately lead to the further development of countries by supporting infrastructure, uh, roads, sewers, schools, other types of infrastructure capital. And also, the World Bank has also provided advice to nations to best use their capital. The World Bank and the IMF were established after World War II, which was ultimately designed to help Europe to rebuild after the conflict. And of course, this grew over time and led to a lot of really great things happening in the world. And one of those things, of course, is education. With improved education, there is improved human capital performance. There are what gap wages that have been established based on the difference between educated and uneducated workers. Of course, an opportunity cost here are wages that are foregone because as you're going to school, you're not working because you're going to school during that time. And so, of course, the opportunity cost there is the foregone wages. Overall, education is a very positive thing, and it does lead to larger subsidies being invested into individuals. Other measures of GDP that ultimately lead to growth as well are things like health and nutrition. As individuals, as humans are educated, the higher education that they have, the healthier they typically are. And the healthier that individuals are, the more productive they are at work. And they also typically earn higher salaries. So there's a direct correlation between the health of individuals and the health of the economy. This also leads, of course, to higher standards of living. But of course, unfortunately, the opposite is also true. Nations that are not as wealthy, oftentimes their populations are not as healthy. So that correlation is very, very true. And of course, policies and economic changes also impact the future growth and development of nations. Another thing to look at when we look at the growth of the overall economy is property rights. Here in the United States, we're very fortunate to live in a country where we have wonderful rights afforded to us for things like property. We have the ability to own and protect our property against the government and against other people. So that is a great thing for us, and it also leads to economic growth. This is not true in some countries where there is a dictatorship or a environment that is not politically advantageous to the citizens. So property rights are a great thing, and they oftentimes lead to growth. Without them, without property rights, there are things like corruption, fraud, and other issues that happen in those countries. And one of those biggest things is the political instability. So when there's political instability, oftentimes it leads to a revolution, and within that revolution, there's a change of hand in the way that the government is run. With free trade, there is substantial economic growth because of the ability to trade with countries without tariffs or quotas impacting that trade. Now, of course, with tariffs and quotas, it does help the national economy to protect the employment situation within the country that are developing those goods and services. However, it oftentimes also leads to higher prices. Now, of course, with free trade, it also encourages imports and exports, which sometimes conflict with the strategic plans of the economies. Research and development also leads to future growth because we're able to create new products, goods, and services that lead to improved technology and just overall very good things. So, in most cases, research and development is a very good thing, and it leads to wonderful change. And one of the things we talked about is the population growth. As a population continues to grow, as long as that population is being supported by goods, services, education, and other socioeconomic conditions, that economy that's growing in terms of population will do well. However, there are limits, and it's important to understand those kinds of limits. And of course, one of those limits is when you have sustained growth in population, you oftentimes have more scarcities when it comes to goods and services. So, yeah. And of course, we always want to promote growth through continued technological improvement, even as the world continues to grow in terms of population, as long as the technology continues to advance along with that growth in population, the more efficient humans will be in terms of sustained growth. Okay, so that is the end of our discussion on when it comes to production and growth. Now, I do want to again call your attention to where we are in the classroom. We along with this chapter, you have the quiz and the hypothesis, and we also have the midterm exam. So I'm going to switch gears again, and we will talk about the midterm exam. So please stand by.